Thank you very much, Ethan. At the end of the service, we will be receiving the sacraments. So those of you who are watching from home, I want to encourage you to participate and make preparations for that. And I'm sure that everybody here today is aware that this has been politically for us as a nation an intense week. And any time that we have tension like this as a nation, it's our opportunity as believers. And I want to talk for just a couple of minutes about that. And I want to start by telling you a story that if you don't like maybe parts of it, just say he doesn't know or he doesn't know what he's talking about. And so you could just sort of do that. In 1807, Britain abolished slavery after the influence of the Pope John Wesley and the Anglican Church, and most of all, a member of Parliament by the name of Wilberforce was most instrumental in abolishing slavery in 1807 and throughout all of the British colonies. And that put an enormous amount of pressure on the United States to do something about the fact that slavery was still very legal here and maybe even flourishing more so than ever. And the Congress of the United States at that time, Jackson, felt a lot of pressure to do something. And so there was this compromise that was created between northern states and southern states. And this was the compromise. The compromise was that the trade of slavery would be abolished, but slaves themselves would not be free. Now, so in 1808, slavery as a trade, meaning there could be no more slaves brought into the United States, and the slaves that were here could not any longer be sold back and forth as property, but their descendants in procreation would be born into slavery. And at the time, in 1808, there were 4 million slaves in the South. But the compromise was that for 20 years, this would not be brought up in Congress. For 20 years. And with the idea that this timeline would give southern states the opportunity to move away from an economy that was driven by slave labor. Now, the only problem was when they came to the end of the 20 years, instead of there being 4 million slaves, there was something like 12 million slaves. So you see, all of a sudden, this huge part of the Southern economy was driven by slave labor. And so they began to work on different compromises this way and that way. And they ratified the Louisiana Purchase right along that same time, 1828. And some of those states were free, and some of those states were slave states. And then the Mexican War in Texas came into the Union as a slave state, and on and on and on and on this went until about 1840. There was another attempt at a compromise that was a timeline that would eventually lead to slaves being free people. But once again, it was thwarted by different reasons for different things. And along came this political party somewhere in the 1850s called the Republicans, of all things. And they had a single focus, and that was the abolishment of slavery. Now, that's kind of hard to imagine in our society today, but the Republican Party started as a result with a single issue of the abolishment of slavery. And throughout the 1850s, all through there, they kept running candidates who did nothing and couldn't really get anywhere with it, until this guy by the name of Abraham Lincoln, this man of tall stature, but he kind of had this passive way about him. He didn't have a lot of charisma, as we think of politicians having today. And he was elected president, but his view on slavery was so intense and so staunch and so defined that before he was ever inaugurated, South Carolina had seceded from the Union and declared themselves an independent country. All right. Now, this occurred because these two groups were not able to create a compromise that they could live with and enforce and work with until the ultimate objective was achieved. And so the cost of that, the cost of the inability to compromise, was the death of 500,000 men and a president. And I want to say that again. The inability not to create a real and authentic compromise that led to the end of slavery cost us as a nation 500,000 lives, a president, an entire economy of the South and a culture as described in the movie Gone with the Wind, all because of an inability to compromise. Now, I don't know if you know this or ever thought about this. The founding fathers intended for our system to be a system of compromise. It only works when there is compromise. There is not to be winners and losers in our system. In other words, there are to be people that come away with something, even though it's not exactly what they wanted. And you're going to hear a lot of people in the course of the next few, I would say 2 or 3 weeks, saying, we just need to come together, we need to unify this nation, we need to do this thing, until people can articulate how it is that they are willing to forfeit a piece of their belief. They're not really talking compromise. And see, there are actually people that should not run for political office because they don't have the ability, morally, intellectually, or you see, socially. They lack the inability to create compromise in their life. And we've met people like that. So why is it that all of a sudden that we as a nation have lost the ability to compromise? Supreme Court Justice, of course, that was just ratified. You see, it's like there's a winner and there's a loser. Well, our founding fathers didn't intend for it to be that way. They intended for there to be someone, yes, who got more because someone else gave up something in order to get something else. Listen, compromise is the most sophisticated of all human behavior. See, it's the ability to forfeit a piece of something over here in order to get something over here, and to give up something over here in order to get something over. Listen, animals cannot do that. And about 90% of the countries throughout the world cannot do that. Now, why is it that all of a sudden we have reverted back to this inability to compromise? And it comes down to this. It comes down to money. Money. What does that have to do with it? You see, you cannot raise money to be reelected with some middle-of-the-road, reasonable point of view. You're not going to get any money like that. No, nobody's going to support you if you say, listen, I can create compromises that are good for everybody. You can't raise money like that. You've got to be a crazy, way off to one side or the other that attracts people that are willing to sacrifice for some crazy notion. That's how you raise money. So you see, once again, money has thwarted our ability to make compromises in a system that only works with people that have the ability to do that. Now, that's sophisticated behavior. Not everybody's capable of that. You know, I said all of that to say Jesus speaks to, in the Sermon on the Mount, our responsibility as believers to resolve conflict. There's several things that Jesus says to us about resolving conflict, even political conflict, family conflict, work conflict, wherever conflict lives, so wherever people are. He intended for us as believers to be the initiators of resolution. See? This is not about, you see, being right or being wrong. This is about elevating resolving conflict above, you see, all of the rest. And here's what Jesus says, and therefore, if you have a gift at worship and you're placing it at the altar and you remember an unresolved conflict with your brother, your sister, leave the gift there in front of the altar. First, go and reconcile the issue, then come back and offer your gift. Settle matters quickly, advisedly, and so that they won't have to go to court. Can you believe Jesus is saying this 2,000 years ago? I mean, it's like he had this vision into our lives today. And so he says, listen, if you're at church and you're worshiping and all of a sudden you remember this unresolved conflict with your brother, your sister, your neighbor, somebody at work, the most important thing then is not continuing worship, but is to go and reconcile yourself to that brother. That's how important this whole business of reconciliation, of unity is to Jesus. It's one of the hallmarks of Christianity. We have the responsibility, you see, of being peacemakers in our society. And the Apostle Paul says this. He says, "And the fullness of Christ," the highest level of spiritual maturity is seen in unity. Isn't that odd? Because, you know, religion is almost always defined by how it is we don't do that. It's almost always defined that way. There's several things that Jesus says about resolving conflict. First thing that he says, do this quickly. Don't let this go on and on and on. As quickly as you can resolve this, he says, I want you to resolve this. Another thing that he says about conflict, he says, go to this person, and when you go to them, do it face to face and do it one-on-one. Now, I'm not making this up. That's how important it is to Jesus that we be the ambassadors to all of the tension and all of the conflict and all of the strife that exists out here today. Our job is to teach people a different way. Jesus says, as quickly as you can, resolve conflict in your life. And I'll just be honest with you, as a leader, this has been one of the biggest weaknesses that I have, in that instead of addressing things when they were small and insignificant, I kind of let them go on and go on and go on and go on until I'm so ticked about it that I'm uncharacteristically tough, and then people don't know how to deal with me. See? In other words, I should have addressed it way back when it was something small. And yes, that may be a little uncomfortable, but it's nothing like when it gets out here and all of a sudden I'm as tough as nails, and they've never met this person. And Jesus says, resolve these things quickly in your life. Resolve them quickly. Don't let this gather, tension gathers interest. And man, it compounds interest. What starts out as almost nothing. And Joy and I have found ourselves in arguments that have gone on 2 or 3 days, and then not be able to remember what it was that started the argument. Now, I'm sure we're the only people that have ever done that. You see, the longer this continues, it gathers interest, it compounds interest, and then the intensity of trying to deal with it at this point, you see, is just catastrophic. I mean, it's hard. There's something else he says. He says, go face to face and do it one-on-one. Now, I've talked about this before. This face-to-face business and this one-on-one business. We all know when we're upset, the kind of email we write is so different than what we would say in person. Once again, maybe that's only true with me. Or, yeah, I mean, and we've all written this email, and then, and I've said this before, and you punch send, and then you go, oh, if I could just get that back. By the way, there is a service now that holds it 3 minutes. So they knew about me. See, it holds it for 3 minutes. And then you can decide, well, maybe I shouldn't have done that. And you can retrieve it and get it back. GoDaddy has that service, in case you want it. He says go face-to-face, one-on-one. Why one-on-one? Because it's so hard without an audience to inflate things and get egos involved and all of this kind of stuff. You see, when I'm just there with that person, the level of honesty is just so much different. And the level of toughness, if it's just me and them, is so much different. And Jesus says, by the way, there might be an explanation. And if that's true, you have maintained a friendship. Every once in a while, I see something on Instagram or Facebook, and I don't think less of who's being trashed. Who do I think less of? The trash man. Seriously. I think less of the trash man than I do who's being trashed. And I think to myself, do they not know how they look in doing this? Now, to make this as practical as I can, I know talking to people one-on-one by yourself is one of the toughest things there is. But I'm going to tell you something. I've done this 33 years. 33 years. I can only think of 2 times in my life, in all the times that I've approached people, that privately, one-on-one, it severed the relationship. 2 times. In other words, it almost always ends with the restoration and the feeling that now we can move on, either because I told that person this hurt me, or they told me it hurt them, or that I misunderstood, and it gives us the opportunity to move on. 2 times, and if I would tell you what those were, it wouldn't surprise you. Twice. You see, Jesus knew that if we did this privately to this person, that somehow egos didn't come into play, the need to defend yourself against all of your friends, and then this escalation of emails, trash on Instagram and Facebook. It doesn't have to go there. And the next, really, I want us as believers to see it as our responsibility to have the role of ambassadors of reconciliation. I want us to see that as our job. When my kids were little, I don't know how, they both came to own a goldfish. And I guess every child, every kid somewhere has had a goldfish. And the 2 goldfish lived in the same goldfish bowl. And it came time to clean out the goldfish bowl, and they put the water and the fish in the sink. And then they take the bowl and they kind of wash it out and put new water in it. Well, while they were in the sink, kind of swishing around, one of them went down that overflow drain. You know what I'm talking about? And Faith says, John, that was your fish. Okay? He said, no, it wasn't either. It was your fish. Listen, once the fish is gone, There's no retrieving it. It's time to move on. See? And get the one that remains in the bowl. Because all of the fussing and fighting about whose fish it is doesn't somehow retrieve that fish. We are the ambassadors of reconciliation, of unity, of resolving conflict. That's what we are. That's our job. That's our role. Why? Because it was that important to Jesus. Therefore, it should be that important to us. Would you bow your heads?